Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to discuss in this section is how you do not really exist. But that's okay. I don't really exist either. And the world around us doesn't really exist either, at least not in the way that we think it does, because we're secretly trapped in a web of oppression and exploitation, and we just think it's normal because of the false consciousness that's been stamped onto our brains by an oppressive society. And I'm going to explain what all of that means in this lecture on postmodern and literary anthropologies. And what I'm going to do is follow that outline right up above my head, and I'm going to explain to you those symbols there on the left, and we're going to start by talking about symbols and how symbols actually work within a human culture. Now, remember that humans see and perceive everything not as it actually exists, not as it objectively exists, but as we perceive it to be existing. Hence, all humans assign meaning and are taught, they are enculturated to assign certain meanings to certain objects. This cultural meaning is a symbol. It is an object. It could be concrete, it could be completely abstract, that stands for a set of culturally assigned values. But which set of values depending on the observer. Now, so we have an object, we perceive the object, and that perception affects our reaction. We react to our perception of an object, an event, or a symbol. Hence, we see an octagonal metal shape that's painted in red and white with STOP on it, and we interpret it as a stop sign. We go, hey, that's a stop sign. And that provokes a reaction in us, which we should roll our motor vehicle to a stop, unless you want to be a rebel and just blast right on through that thing. Don't actually do that. Anyway, so we have an event. We have an event or a symbol, and we have multiple observers of this event, of this symbol, but each of them are going to interpret that event or symbol in a slightly different way. And because they are each interpreting it in a slightly different way, because they are perceiving it slightly differently, they are all going to react in slightly different ways. Multiple perspectives occur of any event, of any symbol. Each observer possesses a slightly different perception, and because they have a different perception, this is going to trigger a different response. For example, let's actually do an exercise where we look at different perceptions and different responses of these perceptions. Write down in your notes A, and then write down what you see in the Rorschach ink blot right up above my head. What do you see there? I know what I see, but I don't want to influence your perception. Let's move on to B. Write down what you see for B. I know what I see. What do you see? Write down your perception of this Rorschach ink blot. Now we're moving to C. Write down your perception of this ink blot. What do you see? D. What do you see? I know what I see. Probably we're not going to see the same thing. These are, of course, Rorschach ink blots. They are intentionally abstract patterns that are created to give like some sort of idea of the internal mental processes of the observer. Now, can you actually be an authority on Rorschach ink blots? Is any one person's perception superior or privileged to any other person's perception? The answer is, of course, no. Everyone's perception of a Rorschach ink blot is intentionally the same. It's equal. And what do ink blots say? An ink blot really doesn't say, what you saw in the ink blot doesn't say anything about the ink blot. What it does is it says something about you, about what's going on in your noggin. Some people see pretty butterflies. Other people see dogs with their heads split open. That tells you what's going on inside your brain meat. A postmodern anthropology basically sees culture as essentially a series of Rorschach ink blots, an array of traditions, of facts, of impressions that defies easy explanation or any easy authority. You can have different observers of the same cultural event, and they're all going to perceive it slightly differently. They're all going to react slightly differently, and no perception or no reaction is necessarily privileged over any other. Often claims of authority or claims of explanation say less about the culture, just like they say less about the ink blot. the culture being studied. And basically what they say is about the internal mental processes of the observer. A postmodern anthropology kind of views descriptions of culture like mirrors, that the observers, these old school anthropologists, observed these cultures and simply invented or saw what they wanted to see. And it often just says something about them. It reflects their own ambitions, their own perceptions, their own collection of a priori facts than it does anything about the culture they studied. Ultimately, what you see in a mirror is what you bring to the mirror. The mirror itself holds nothing. So let's talk about symbols. Let's talk about what they could mean. And here I've collected a series of 4 symbols. What are these things? What could they mean? Are they going to mean the same thing to the same, are they going to mean the same thing to a group of people? And let's start with the image there on the upper left. If you've never seen this image, these are the signs that used to be on the highways of Southern California from about the 1960s, and they removed them, I think, in the early 2000s. And basically, the signs were meant to address a problem, that you had these undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens, would sneak across the California-Mexico border, and they would often be told to just follow the freeway to reach Los Angeles, because the freeways ran north and south. However, a lot of these guys were really quite poor, and they didn't understand that you couldn't actually walk down a freeway. And they didn't know that these freeways would have like dozens of cars. All these cars are zipping around at 70 or 80 miles an hour. So there was this rash of pedestrians, these illegal aliens, getting hit by cars on the freeway. So California decided to put up these series of signs warning drivers that there might be people crossing the road. You might have these undocumented families trying to cross the freeway, and that you had to be aware that they were there, and that then the signs were also to tell a lot of these illegal aliens that you shouldn't be crossing the freeway because the driver is going to be on top of you before the driver can actually see you. Now that was the expressed reason for these signs, but again, different people saw the signs and different people interpreted the sign differently. Some people saw the sign and went, oh, I have to be careful. People might be trying to cross the freeway. Other people saw the sign, rolled their eyes, and was like, oh my God, this is a huge problem. We've got to stop this. Other people saw the sign and went, oh, this is blatant racism against these undocumented workers who are coming up from Mexico just looking for a better life for themselves. We had multiple interpretations of the same sign, even though it's a traffic sign, and it provoked different set of reactions. And eventually, these signs were removed from the highways of Southern California. And of course, the number of people being hit on the freeway went up. Now, let's take that second image. It's this huge, beautiful tree. One person can look at that and go, oh, well, that's just a tree. Another person can look at that and say, that's a symbol of nature. It's a symbol of Mother Earth. Everything that is good and wonderful and pure, about our planet. Still, a third person can look at that and say, oh, that's a pecan tree. Let's go get some pecans. I actually don't know if that's a pecan tree. I have no idea. Another person might look at that and go, oh, lumber. I want to build a new deck for my house. And they're going to go cut it down. Different perceptions of this are going to provoke different responses. The Statue of Liberty, Dama Libertad herself. What is she? Well, she's liberty enlightening the world. It's a symbol of liberty. It's in, of course, New York Harbor. Originally sort of crafted to forge, the friendship, to acknowledge the alliance between America and France, because she is French. Built in France, erected in New York Harbor. It was supposed to be a symbol of Mother Liberty, who was the mother of two different nations, both America and France. Both of them were born in revolutions at the same time. However, the perception of Lady Liberty began to change as soon as she was erected in New York Harbor. Some people saw her as a symbol of New York itself. And if you go to New York, Lady Liberty is on all of these caps and handkerchiefs and towels and beer koozies. She's all over the place. She has become a symbol of New York City itself. And because so many immigrants in the early 20th century saw Lady Liberty as their first sight of America, she became a symbol of immigration itself. Is any of these perceptions privileged over any other? are all of these interpretations the same? And the answer is, of course, there is no privileged reading of a symbol, not that we can tell. And all of these perceptions, all of these symbolic interpretations are essentially equal. There we go. There's the thing on the left. One person can look at that and go, wow, $50. Another person looks at that and says, that's money. Money is just a lie. It's all paper and ink anyway, and it is. A third person can look at that and go, ooh, dinner with my girl, or dinner with my boy, or dinner with my whatever. Another person can look at that and go, money is the root of all evil. It's awful. Are these radically different interpretations? Are any of them privileged over any other? And that is how a postmodern anthropology views culture, as a Rorschach ink blot. You have all of these people doing all of these things, doing all of these behaviors and doing all of these acts, and you have all of these observers of that culture, but all of these different perceptions and all of these different reactions are ultimately equal to one another. Culture is a collection of observations and behaviors, but it can be endlessly interpreted by many different observers. Thus, there is no such thing as a privileged perspective on human culture. Any explanation or any interpretation is often going to tell you not about what's being observed, but about the observer themselves, just like a Rorschach ink blot does. It's not going to tell you about, the pattern of the ink. It's going to tell you about the inner workings of the observer. Now, postmodern anthropology comes from a larger intellectual movement called Postmodernism, and there it is in all caps, which developed in the 1970s and the 1980s, mostly in France. Postmodernism was an intellectual movement that came out of France of the 70s and 80s, and it ultimately came to be firmly ensconced within academia throughout Western universities. And indeed, postmodern anthropology is pretty much 60 to 80% of anthropology today. It is kind of the dominant paradigm of cultural anthropology. So before I explain postmodern anthropology, I have to sit and kind of explain postmodernism itself. And to do that, we have to go to the 19th century and talk about the events of 1968, the birthplace of postmodernism. And we're going to start with that fellow there on the lower left, and his name is Karl Marx. Karl Marx was an economist in the mid to late 19th century, and he came up with a series of ideas about how society and the economy worked, and then made a series of very radical predictions based on those ideas. It was to be called Marxism. And Karl Marx basically had this idea about value. He argued that value is actually finite, it's fixed. There's only so much value in the world. And this is because value itself exists as a function of production. That a worker puts time and effort and energy into an object, and that time and energy and effort determines the intrinsic value of that object. And because there's only so many people in the world, there's only so much time and effort and energy, ergo, the amount of wealth in the world is fixed. It's fixed and finite. And furthermore, in society as a whole, society is locked into a series of class conflicts over this fixed value, this set level of wealth. And in particular, Marx argued that what defines history is the struggle between two classes: the working class, the proletariat, and the capital class, the bourgeoisie. And Marx argued that internal competition among the capitalists, among the bourgeoisie, would cause them to extract greater and greater amounts of wealth and value from the proletariat. And they're going to squeeze the proletariat and extract from them time and energy and effort in an attempt to overcome their own bourgeois rivals. And this is eventually going to lead to, these are the predictions that Marx made back in the 19th century, this will eventually lead to a great uprising of the proletariat. Eventually the proletariat will be squeezed and oppressed so much that it will snap and rise up in a great workers' revolt, destroy the bourgeoisie, destroy capitalism, and then establish the workers' paradise of a communist utopia in which everyone is a proletariat and the working class owns their own means of production. Hence the propaganda poster on the upper left: defend the working class, class struggle divides. So these are the predictions that Marx made, that in the great industrialized cities in the great industrialized societies of North America and Western Europe, that eventually a great workers' uprising is coming, and he explains this in the Communist Manifesto, and that revolt is going to come because of the internal competition of the bourgeoisie. However, there was a big problem with this. That great uprising that Marx predicted, it never happened. In fact, almost all of the predictions of Karl Marx, were simply wrong. And in fact, what appeared to happen, especially after World War II, what appeared to happen is something that Marx never predicted. That it turns out that the set value of wealth in the world, the amount of value that exists in the world, is not actually set. Because value does not depend on time, energy, and effort. It fluctuates along curves of supply and demand. And it turns out that the amount of wealth and value in the world is not fixed, and in fact can increase. And this is what happened in the years after World War II, that the amount of wealth in the world increased. The amount of value went up. People became wealthier. That's not supposed to happen according to Karl Marx. And what's really not supposed to happen to Karl Marx is not that the proletariat is going to destroy the bourgeoisie, but what happened throughout the industrialized Western societies is that the proletariat became the bourgeoisie. The coal miner in Wales worked hard, put his son through school, and his sons and grandsons became doctors and lawyers and university professors. All right? What Marx didn't expect is that the lifestyle of the bourgeoisie was so attractive, everyone emulated it, and people wanted to become the bourgeoisie. That wasn't supposed to happen. So the predictions of Karl Marx largely failed by the 1950s and 60s, except in one place where it seemed they almost might come true. And now the stage is set for Paris, May 1968. And what happens in May of 1968 in Paris is that a series of leftist student protests begin against the conservative government of Charles de Gaulle, the great sort of French war hero. The protests rapidly spiraled into these massive street battles between protesters, rioters, and the police and the security forces. The riots swept Paris itself. By the end of the month, riots had spread to other cities in Paris, and it had paralyzed France itself. The entire government of France started to wobble. It looks like the rioters and the protests were growing larger and larger every day. Look at the paper. Paris mans the barricades. 15,000 students fight 8,000 police. The French police and the French protesters battled across the country. The government itself, the government of France, collapsed. Charles de Gaulle himself had to flee the country. Irony of ironies, he had to seek refuge in Germany, in West Germany. What's left of the government ordered the French army to come out. The French army surrounded Paris, but the generals reported to what was left of the government and said, look, man, if you order the troops into Paris, we are not confident that our soldiers will obey us. That instead of suppressing the riots, the soldiers, instead of suppressing the protesters, the soldiers might join them. And then the student protesters now have an army. So it was very uncertain whether the French army would actually support what was left of the French government. France itself was on the verge of a major Marxist revolution, kind of like Marx predicted back in the 19th century. So to de-escalate things, what was left of the French government, the besieged French government, and the protesters decided on a series of meetings. And they agreed on a couple things. Charles de Gaulle is not coming back. He's going to stay out of the government. In fact, stay out of France, preferably. That we're going to have early elections. And both the conservative government and the Marxist protesters are going to be able to freely make their ideas to the French electorate. They're going to have early elections. We're going to agree on a new government. We're going to stick by these elections. And the student protesters were absolutely confident. They're like, look, our uprising has succeeded. We are going to establish a communist utopia in France. The workers' paradise is going to exist. These new elections are going to usher into a new Marxist revolution, and it's going to be awesome in France. And it never happened. It absolutely did not happen. Not only did the police and the military not side with the revolutionaries, and in fact, after the elections were agreed on, the army actually renewed its support for the French government. Individual soldiers wrote, letters and signed petitions saying, we support the democratic government of France. And they actually held these early elections. And in these early elections, French voters comprehensively rejected the Marxist revolutionaries. They overwhelmingly rejected leftist and Marxist candidates. If you look at the map right above my head, that's every area in blue is an area that voted in a more conservative government. And even the red areas, those aren't areas that the Marxists won. Those are areas where the Marxists had to share their electorate with like other third or fourth party candidates. In fact, the results of the election resulted in an even more conservative government than existed before 1968. May 1968 was the revolution that didn't happen. And this triggered a major soul searching among leftist intellectuals as to why the people didn't side with the party of the people. Why did the proletariat, which became the bourgeoisie, why did both people completely reject the Marxists? Why did the workers reject the party of the workers? And one of the things that came out of this intellectual soul searching was postmodernism, an attempt to explain why the revolution of 1968 failed. Now, postmodern philosophers and writers, including those guys on the left, that's Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, concluded that the reason that the revolution of 1968 failed was because people are locked within frameworks of false consciousness. This is actually an old Marxist idea that was kind of revivified by these postmodernists. A false consciousness is the idea that the inequalities, the capitalist exploitations, and the casual oppressions of modern society are actually hidden inside of the dominant culture. Academics and societal elites use art, they use literature, they use the sciences to make people believe that the oppression of normal society is somehow natural and a normal state of affairs. The people of France were oppressed and exploited. The Marxists were right, but because they are locked within frameworks of false consciousness, they don't know that they're being exploited. The world as they understand it doesn't really exist the way they think it does. And not only did these postmodern intellectuals explain why the revolution of 1968 failed, they came up with a program as to how the next revolution is going to succeed. The goal of a postmodern scholar is then to deconstruct the means by which this false consciousness is created. It is to show how people have been systematically lied to throughout their entire lives. Art lies to you. Literature lies to you. Professors lie to you. The sciences lie to you. Entertainment lies to you. All of these things lie to you in an attempt to get you to think that the oppressive, exploitative system that we live in is somehow normal and that somehow you're not actually free. You are oppressed and exploited. And the goal of a postmodern intellectual is to identify, subvert, and counter these cultural structures and institutions that allow large-scale oppression and exploitation. And that's what they did in these big, thick books translated from the French right up above me. This is also why a lot of the early postmodernists are French. In addition, postmodernism was to lay the groundwork through the next version of May 1968 will succeed. In fact, it goes a long way in explaining the events of 2020. Anyway, postmodernism is an explicitly political framework. And until that great revolution comes, until they can kind of prove Marx to be finally correct, what postmodern intellectuals, what these postmodern scholars are to do is to help in the identification of these structures of oppression and that the identification of how this false consciousness is itself created can be used to further the cause of social and economic justice and improve the lot of the oppressed and exploited members of society. Deconstructing this false consciousness, deconstructing the world as you understand it, can be exposed to be a lie. The world, as you think it exists, does not really exist the way you think it does. Now, these postmodern ideas resonated really strongly within cultural anthropology, and cultural anthropology already kind of knew part of this. It knew that cultural structures shape and maintain how people sort of subjectively interact with the world around them, that your cultural lens affects how you perceive things, and that in turn affects how you react to things. So what a cultural anthropology does is kind of turn this Malinowski style approach around, not to examine these kind of these people living in Trobriand islanders or deep in the Amazonian rainforest, but to turn this approach onto modern society itself, explaining how these frames of false consciousness are constructed and what function this false consciousness serves to the members of the society. And many anthropologists arrived at two conclusions. One, that the function of the sciences, both hard sciences and soft sciences, is to aid in the establishment and construction of this false consciousness. And two, that they themselves were critically positioned to deconstruct how Western society builds its own false consciousness and to aid non-Western people against this sort of Western modern exploitation and oppression. Cultural anthropologists saw themselves as uniquely positioned to institute postmodern analysis and deconstruction of culture. Particularly influential among anthropologists was the work of the postmodern scholar Edward Said, 1935 to 2003. In a series of books beginning with 1978's Orientalism, Edward Said argued that Western politicians and academics are actually projecting identity onto non-Western peoples, that the old traditional anthropologists, the old traditional scholars, are not so much studying other people as simply telling those people how they are. And Said is specifically focusing on Arabic cultures of the Middle East. And in basically, when Western scholars describe these sort of Arabic cultures, it doesn't really describe them. It is merely attempting to transform them into this kind of objectified other. And in this way, the social sciences are serving as a kind of new colonialism. It is mystifying and crafting stereotyped images of these studied peoples in order to justify their exploitation and oppression. Hence, Said argued, there is really no way that Western scholars can study or judge any action, any cultural structure, or any institution possessed by the peoples of the Arabic Middle East. It all serves this kind of neo-colonialist, capitalist, and imperialist exploitation, that in attempting to study the people of the Middle East, the social sciences are merely aiding in their exploitation. Hence, there's no real way to study these people at all. Hence, the postmodern anthropologists rapidly arrived at the conclusion that what Malinowski was actually doing, what Franz Boas was actually doing, is really nothing more any different from what the old imperialists were doing back in the early to mid 19th century. They're doing the same kind of sort of Victorian explanation, Victorian exploration of these people, that they are merely crafting images of the Trobriand islanders. They're merely crafting images of, the Inuit of Baffin Island in order to sort of put them into boxes so that they can be addressed, exploited, and oppressed by sort of these neo-colonialist, imperialist forces of modern capitalist society. That's all you did, guys, at least from a postmodern perspective. So a postmodern anthropology involves kind of a new program for studying culture in a way that it's not just a Rorschach ink blot, that studying culture in a way that it's not just staring into a mirror and writing down what you see, because all you see in a mirror is yourself. A postmodern anthropology is a new approach to studying culture, and I've kind of characterized it in basically 5 points that will follow. 1, a postmodern anthropology involves an explicit rejection of any kind of authoritative perspective on the people being studied. Classes cannot really be explained or interpreted at all. You can't explain culture. You can't interpret culture. 2, an explicitly political activism aimed at aiding these oppressed and exploited people in their struggle against Western imperialism and capitalism. 3, a postmodern anthropology involves a rejection of anything resembling the scientific method. Postmodern anthropology explicitly rejects science. All perspectives are equally valid, and there is no such thing as an objective perspective. And in fact, there's no such thing even as a privileged perspective. All perspectives are equal. You stare at the ink blot, and everyone's interpretation of the ink blot is the same. 4. Anthropology, like all forms of knowledge, really acts as a mirror, reflecting back not what actually exists, but what we have already decided exists. The mirror merely reflects what you bring to it. And lastly, 5, to some, at least some postmodern anthropologists, like Lilia Abu-Lughod, which you've read, postmodern anthropology involves a rejection of the central concept of culture itself, as all culture is really doing is sort of putting people into a box by which they can be sort of objectified and commodified. All that little box does is create and perpetuate stereotypes of the people being studied, commodifying people into objects to be ruled and exploited. Now, one of the things I'm not going to do is to criticize either postmodernism in general or postmodern anthropology specifically. There exist very, very critical, very, very biting critiques of both. And you are free to read them in and of yourself. There are very, very, really biting critiques of postmodernism and really biting critiques of postmodern anthropology. But to some extent, regardless of how much teeth these critiques have, they have not had a lot of traction in reducing kind of the influence of postmodernism, largely because postmodernism rejects authoritative knowledge. So how can you reject them? Because you're being authoritative and I'm not trying. Anyway, the critiques exist out there and you are free to read them if you want, because I'm not going to do it here. The first kind of major postmodern anthropologist was a guy called Clifford Geertz. And Clifford Geertz kind of embraced the postmodernism of the 60s and into the 1970s, and he kind of came up with a new way to study culture. He was like, how do I study culture in a postmodern framework? How do I study culture acknowledging that there is no such thing as a privileged perspective? How do I study culture and don't put people into boxes that can turn them into objects to be exploited and commodified? And Geertz focused on the cultures of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, initially focusing on agricultural practices. He started out as a very sort of Malinowski structure-function guy, looking at how structures function within society. But he eventually came to a conclusion that these social and agricultural systems, these cultural structures, cannot really be understood without consideration of the underlying mental processes that were involved. This takes him deep into symbolic anthropology and leads him to a postmodern perspective. So he decided to create something new. He decided to build an anthropology coming from a postmodern framework. And this involved observing and understanding the symbolic nature of the symbolic system that was being used by the people, especially understanding it in terms and in the context of its own culture. And this led Geertz to actually reject participant observation. Geertz rejected participant observation. He had adopted a new approach, one that merely interprets events, and one that usually interprets events in collaboration with the people that are being studied. This kind of new way to study human culture, this new anthropology, is an explorative literary effort that Geertz calls thick description. We've already talked about how the Boasian approach, where you observe, describe, and interpret. We talked about the Malinowski kind of structure-function approach, in which you look at the function that cultural structures serve. Here is our third one, Geertz's thick description, in which you merely describe events and offer interpretations, but even those small, soft interpretations are usually provided by the people you're actually studying. And there's a quote by Geertz right up above. Doing ethnography is like trying to read a manuscript, foreign, faded, full of ellipses, incoherencies, suspicious emendations, and tendentious commentaries, but written not in conventional graphs of sounds, but in the transient examples of shaped behavior. So Geertz is looking at culture like it's this kind of odd book that many different people have edited, and that he can't really explain and has to have other people explain it to him. A thick description holds that an anthropologist can't really interpret events at all, or if one does, some kind of projection of false consciousness can't really be avoided. All you can really do with culture is merely describe events as they take place. It's a thick description. You have to describe things with really thick blocks of text. And you have to leave any kind of potential analysis or explanation to the reader themselves. A postmodern anthropology, thick description, specifically wanted anthropology to be a non-scientific endeavor. It wanted anthropology to be basically a literary endeavor that sought not to explain culture, but to tell a story about the culture, to thickly describe what is observed, and not really offer much in the way of explanation at all. To describe the event and leave perception and explanation of the event to the readers themselves. So the little stick figures there on the lower left, those are the readers. And here we have postmodern anthropologies. And this is what most anthropologists do in the 21st century. Hence, these postmodern anthropologies tend to be these very, very literary efforts. They're more like descriptive works of nonfiction than traditional anthropological monographs. They tend to focus not on large groups of people, but on single individuals, telling stories about these individuals or writing down the stories that those individuals tell themselves. You know, a Boasian approach is going to be a psychological interpretations. A Malinowski style structure function approach is going to talk about institutions and cultural structures. A postmodern approach is going to talk about stories. And in fact, postmodern anthropologies don't even sort of focus on like a typical member of a society, but frankly, they tend to focus on the people that have been cast out of society, the people that are not at the center of society, but are at the fringes of society. And so we've got, you know, Vincent Crapazano's story of an illiterate Moroccan tile maker who thinks he's married to a camel she-demon. There is a social outcast on a Caribbean island who's like, everyone thinks he's crazy. That's Oscar. Or the stories of these poor migrant women in Portugal, not focusing on sort of the typical members of the society, but on the outcasts of the society, the migrant workers, the insane, the people of dubious mental stability, and people in the social and economic margins of the world. And again, a postmodern anthropology is specifically politically active. A postmodern anthropology seeks to sort of shift the political conversation on the hot political topics of the day. And this is done constantly. Their idea is to create a scholarship that moves the political debate specifically towards the left. It's you, so it would be this way. And they get directly involved in the political debates of the day, going into the politics of anthropology, jumping straight into sort of different cross-cultural stories about gender, jumping right into debates on immigration or debates on the debt. A postmodern anthropology is specifically activist. So in a postmodern manner, I'm going to be a postmodern lecturer for a moment. So instead of telling you what postmodern anthropology is, I'm just going to kind of pause. I'm going to pause, and I'm merely going to thickly describe to you 3 postmodern anthropologies and allow you to sort of explain or interpret them as you will. And the first is this book. This is by Dennis Tedlock. It was published in 1993. It's called Breath on the Mirror, Mythic Voices and Visions of the Living Maya. And what Tedlock does in this book is takes you inside the mind of these Maya shaman who live in the highlands of Guatemala, and how they interact with the spirit world, and how they interact with these sort of living mountains and a landscape that has a deep memory to it, and the landscape which has lords and underworld gods and spirits in the rivers and spirits in the mountains, and how these spirits on this animate landscape speak to the shaman, these sort of magicians, and how the shaman speaks to them, and how time exists simultaneously. How a Maya shaman can stand on the side of a mountain overlooking the valley of Shela, and he doesn't see the modern valley of Shela, but literally he sees a great battle being fought there, because there was a great battle fought in the Battle of Shela 500 years ago. And to these Maya shamans, the past is the future, and the future is the present, and the present is the past that has been, and the past that will be, because the past and the future and the present are all the same. And in Breath on the Mirror, Tedlock does this really interesting way of taking us inside the culture of these Maya shamans, these magicians, who are healing the sick and are seeing the future, and the way they interact with this animate landscape, and the way that the mountains speak to them, and the way that they speak to the spirits of the mountains. That is Dennis Tedlock's Breath on the Mirror. Anna Zing wrote, in fact, she won a really big award for this. In 2004, Anna Zing wrote the book Friction, an Ethnography of Global Connection. And in this, she is telling the story of different perspectives of the environment on the island of Borneo, and how you have all of these different stakeholders, all of these different actors in the rainforests of Borneo. And she tells their stories and how they view the rainforest, how they view the jungle, and how these different perspectives clash against one another. Large parts of this book are nothing but a list of plants and animals, and the different stories attached to these plants and animals, and how you have the indigenous people of Borneo and how they live in and among a rainforest environment, and how they shape the rainforest environment to make their lives easier. And then you have the rainforest environment as it's viewed by the dictatorship of Indonesia, or the past dictatorship of Indonesia, as simply a resource to be sort of scraped from the earth and exploited, and how multinational corporations view the rainforest as an asset, but an asset that they don't want to backfire on themselves, or how Western environmentalists see the rainforest as a place that's pristine and should not involve people at all. And this actually sets up one of the sort of points of friction in her book on how Western environmentalists and the traditional people of the rainforest actually clash quite a bit. You'd think that because they're both trying to save the forest, that they would have a lot of similar ideas, but no, there's actually quite a bit of friction. That to these Western environmentalists in America and in Europe, they want to basically set aside, take large parts of the island and simply make it free of people. Their view of a perfect natural world is a world without people, a park that doesn't have people in it. But the traditional people of Borneo, that's not how they view saving the forest at all. They see saving the forest as making it available to them and sort of cultivating it like a great garden, in which you take care of it, but you use it at the same time. And all of these different stories clash with one another. The multinational corporations want to extract value from the forest, but they don't want to run in problems from the environmentalists or from the locals, and they definitely don't want to get in trouble with the dictatorship. The dictatorship, which doesn't really give two figs about anybody, it just needs a hard sorts of currency. The natural people who are being assaulted from all sides, thinking that their natural allies in the environmentalist movement is going to help them, only to find that the environmentalists want to take their land away and create these pristine parks that nobody can live in. That is Anna Zing's work on the jungles of Borneo and the friction that is caused by these competing narratives about the rainforest. And our third one is, of course, the one you have already read, Abu Lughud's very famous Writing Women's Worlds, in which she's studying the Bedouin women of Western Egypt. But again, she's not describing all of these different things about the culture and then offering this sort of, philosophical or psychological model like Ruth Benedict would have. She's not describing this culture like, Bronislaw Malinowski, looking at how these cultural structures function within the context of that culture. She's merely writing down the stories that these women are telling her about their lives in the Western desert, and more or less leaving an explanation or interpretation of the culture to the individual reader, because there are no privileged perceptions. And she does, in true Geertzian style, asks the people what they think of their own stories. And some of them agree with her, and some of them disagree with her quite sharply, especially towards the end of the book. Because these are the different ways to look at human culture. These are these sort of big paradigms of how to study this kind of ineffable thing that we all have that affects not just our opinions or the way we dress or the way we act. It affects how we construct our family and how we perceive reality itself. And that is what anthropology is all about. And that's all I'm trying to do here. And now, the only thing left to do is to tell me whether I've succeeded or not. Have I taught you anything about anthropology? Have I taught you anything about human culture or the great diversity and variety of different human systems that exist across the world? can you actually answer Franz Boas's original question? Why do the cultures of the world differ, and how have such differences arisen? And the only thing left is for you to articulate this knowledge to me, in the last test of the class. And I will see you there. Yeah, the only thing left is the final. Go away.